welcome to Idea Me. It's a platform for sharing innovative ideas and inspiring stories. We are talking with the people who are shaping the future and who are moving the human story forward. I'm Karen Potter, the Sustainability Ambassador, here to talk about climate change, sustainability, and international standards today. Climate change is surely the defining issue of our time. Social awareness and interest is at an all-time high. Civil society, business, and governments are all clamoring for change. The scale of the challenge, though, is enormous and will require fundamental change across all sectors and areas of our lives, as well as international cooperation and engagement. One way to ensure that we're setting, measuring, and achieving the change required is through collaboration and agreement of professional standards. Establishing best practice helps us, organizations and others, to understand the levels they need to be working to achieve change. It analyzes and documents milestones, tracks changes, and motivates through sharing ideas and processes. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Patrick Mallet, who is the Director of Innovation for ISEAL, the global membership organization for sustainability standards. So hello, Patrick. Welcome today. You're coming here to us from British Columbia. You mentioned that you're out in the wilderness in British Columbia. So that's how you're spending your time isolating during this coronavirus epidemic. Pandemic. I would like to welcome you and ask you to tell us a little bit about your story and your passions and how you came to ISEAL.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, tucked up here in the mountains, it does feel like I'm a bit removed from the day-to-day of this pandemic, but it really does also bring home how interconnected our world is. And just having spoken with many of the CEOs of leading sustainability standards a couple of days ago, understanding already the implications on global supply chains and the reality of the challenges that workers and small producers in agriculture, fisheries, other sectors are already facing, and how tenuous this global economic system is. I think it really highlights some of the critical challenges that we're trying to address. So I'm, as Karen, you mentioned, I'm the innovations director, but I've been with ISEAL since it was founded. I actually helped to found the organization just over 20 years ago, when sustainability standards were fairly new as a concept. They sort of came about as an alternative as governments were stepping away from their social and environmental obligations. Civil society came up and said, well, we need some kind of framework to support better production, and sustainability standards were one of those tools. And so from those early beginnings in a number of sectors, in forestry with the Forest Stewardship Council, and marine with Marine Stewardship Council, and a number of agricultural systems like organic and fair trade, over these 20 years, we've really seen a movement build up where not only have sustainability standards helped to shape the way that companies think about and act on sustainability in their supply chains, but also just helped to normalize the idea that companies are responsible for sustainability and social and environmental well-being within their supply chains, and that these interconnected supply chains really are something that consumers can affect with their purchasing power and their decisions. And now in today's crisis and climate, both the climate crisis and the coronavirus pandemic, I think both of those highlight the importance of sustainability values being maintained and underpinning the choices we make about production and consumption.
And do you think, since you've started on this journey, and it's been 20 years, how would you say this process of getting people to understand the importance of collaborating and achieving sustainable standards, how has that changed from the level of organizations recognizing they have a role to play, and then being motivated to change, and then actually acting on what needs to be done? How would you say that over the 2 decades of your work on this, how have things shifted?
It's funny in the day to day, you kind of think, oh, this is moving too slowly. We're not addressing the problem at the scale or the pace that's needed to fundamentally transform sectors or commodities or production systems. But also looking back over 20 years, we see such fundamental shifts that, 20 years ago, this was fringe. This was the idea that companies should be responsible for the production practices in their supply chain. Maybe there were a few leading organizations, but now we've got to the point where it's an accepted, generally a fairly widely accepted state of practice that companies are being asked to, first of all, know where their products are coming from. So have transparency in their supply chains. And secondly, to actually act on and improve the quality of practices in those supply chains. And you see that from particularly governments coming back into the picture and starting to introduce regulatory obligations on companies, things like due diligence obligations, where companies are required to know what are the human rights practices within their supply chains and to make sure they're addressing those. So the re-engagement by governments, I think, is an important indicator of the mainstreaming of these issues, along with intergovernmental and multilateral agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of emphasis and energy going into 2030 and what can be achieved within this now relatively short time frame. But I think I don't want to put all the onus on companies. I think it's also been really a consumer awareness that has driven a lot of this change, that consumers, partly through these sustainability standards and the logos that we all see on products, whether that's the coffee we drink or the produce we buy, they really have been able to show companies that this is something that consumers care about and are willing to support financially. And of course, there is a big difference between different regions. Europe is generally further ahead in terms of awareness and uptake. North America in some sectors has very high uptake. But if we think globally about how we address these problems, we've still got such a long way to go, because the countries and the markets that are making the big differences in terms of production and consumption, China, India, Southeast Asia, Brazil, there's still a long way to go in terms of both consumer awareness and production practices and priorities.
And do you think that the awareness now that consumers have achieved, so now I mentioned in sort of the opening remarks that we're at sort of one of the highest levels ever of awareness about it and a demand for action. Do you think that the climate strikes, which are led by Greta Thunberg in Sweden and other youth leaders around the globe, and Extinction Rebellion, a campaign activist organization, are these part of the movements that are facilitating that change and that shift? Or do you see other factors as well that are beginning to get people to say, hey, we do have a problem, we need to address this, and we do need to take some action? And it isn't just civil society, but it's businesses and governments, and there's a whole lot of players that need to step up and meet these challenges.
I think it is exactly that. Everyone needs to play their part. Yes, absolutely. The climate marches and all the awareness that's being raised as a result of these initiatives is positive, and in time drives change. As you have consumer awareness, you have pressure, which then it's almost like cogs in a complicated mechanism. One knocks the next one, and slowly the machine starts to move. But when we think about which of those cogs are the most influential, it's often things like government regulation that come in that set the floor of expectations. I think one of the biggest challenges, both with sustainability standards and certification and other market-based tools, is that this is an economic question first and foremost. And it's very difficult to, first of all, imagine consumers paying more for sustainable products in the long term. This has to be a factor that's integrated into the cost of production and not an externality. And that is difficult for companies that are driven by the bottom line, the economic bottom line, to integrate these additional costs. And I think that's where tools like certification help to recognize and reward better producers and companies that support better production, but also where those tools need to be integrated into frameworks. Companies, I think, have a critical role both in being leaders and showing by example what's possible, but then also being creative about new conceptions of what responsibility means. You know, where companies are starting, at least leading companies are starting to think about their conception of what it means to be a responsible company that goes beyond the economic bottom line and looks at their supply chain and the regions or jurisdictions from which they're sourcing products and their obligations to those actors, those workers and companies and people who are feeding the supply chains.
Well, it's interesting. Certainly, governments have a big role to play, and we see here in the United Kingdom when government does lead, it's a very effective tool. We make a lot of decisions around how to help organizations and individuals be more sustainable. For example, the government recently decided that, or agreed that the internal combustion engine must come to an end in domestic transport. And so they have put a time frame on that, which is really, of course, then is a signal to businesses, which in this current climate, and really I think here in the United Kingdom, when maybe you can reflect on whether this is true as well on a global level, regulation has been inconsistent because of, on the back of a global financial meltdown in 2008, and then a number of different challenges we've had here domestically around sort of Brexit and other issues politically. It's been a very inconsistent time, and our businesses here in the United Kingdom have suffered from a clear signal from government and a clear trajectory. Now we've here committed to a net zero target by 2050, which is a very ambitious target here in the United Kingdom, one of the first countries that has set such a target. And this is a signal that provides for businesses and provides for civil society. But it's been inconsistent. I imagine as a global organization, you find that it's very challenging, that you have some governments that are clearly more progressive and are leading the way and are setting an example how policy can make these changes and help lead businesses and consumers and set the right signals. But you are in a situation where some governments have done quite a lot and others have much to do. How do you bring that disparity together, and how do you work in a setting which means that there's an inconsistent sort of policy backdrop and countries are in very different levels of acceptance and awareness? How does that set challenges for you, and how does that also provide an opportunity for you to help bring other countries up to the level that the more progressive countries are dealing with?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think it's, first of all, my initial thought was, it is fascinating to see how fast and extensive the response has been to the COVID-19 crisis pandemic. That when we're faced with a sense of urgency and crisis, governments can act, and they can act at a scale that we really didn't think was possible. So there's not a lack of potential for action. It's more, what are the things that are going to drive governments to act at a pace that is necessary? And it does speak to the power of crisis as a driver of change. But I would say optimistically that the way that a lot of change happens, that we're seeing happening, is through peer example. And so it doesn't matter so much that some governments are further ahead or are leading in their policies and practice, but rather how can we use those examples, make them relevant for other governments and for other actors to say, look, this is what's possible. We have examples of what can be done and how we can address these problems. We'd like, obviously, in general, to see movement beyond commitment to action in a lot of cases, both with governments and with companies. But the idea that we each can do our part and then share those examples and hopefully have others take them up, I think is a powerful vehicle for change. And one of the things that ISEAL tries to do with our own constituency, which is primarily sustainability standards and certification, is provide that platform for exchange and learning. Because that's, we're not individually going to solve any of these problems. It's only through this collective action and building that sense of trust and exchange of knowledge and learning.
So through that process where you're working with many people on a global scale, would you say there is somebody who you've worked with that's inspired you, an individual or maybe individuals that have really affected the way you work or inspired change in your own career direction?
It's funny, and if I can digress a little here, because I'm not generally one to point to individuals. I want to look at my career and recognize that this wasn't the job I got into. I created a position, I created an organization. Certification wasn't really a field. And so what's remarkable is just how this movement has grown up over the last 20 years and how obviously ISEAL has played a small part in that, in bringing organizations together. But if you were to be standing around 20 years ago looking into the future and saying, okay, well, what's the role for sustainability standards? I'm not sure anyone would have predicted how I wouldn't say yet transformational, but how fundamental they've been in creating the space for dialogue and for setting expectations around what good practice looks like for companies and for supply chains. And so really the people that inspire me and keep me enthusiastic about this work are our members, ISEAL's standard-setting organizations, Fair Trade, Marine Stewardship Council, other ones that I've mentioned, but across many different fields. 20 years is the bulk of my career. Another thing, I didn't think I'd be in the same field for 20 years, but because it's the bulk of my career, I've always been told, wow, you're really lucky, you work with really nice people. I don't know any different, but I do know that people in sustainability standards, the CEOs that we work with, the technical staff, they're so committed and passionate and creative. It continues to inspire me to find ways to make these tools better and to ensure that we are actually creating as much change as possible. It's like none of us are in this because it's a job. We're in this because we fundamentally believe that this change needs to happen. It needs to happen quickly. And these tools are some of the best examples we have of how that transition might happen.
Can you give me an example of some of the things, the actual tools that you're working on and some of the standards here in the United Kingdom? In my own experience, I work with an organization called the Energy Saving Trust, and we manage the actual labeling for appliances. And that was a fascinating project. And not only that, but that was very revolutionary in what it was attempting to do, which was to communicate to consumers. There are different levels of products you can buy with various levels of efficiency. And it seems like if you buy the cheaper machine, or the cheaper refrigerator, that's going to be, you know, a good investment, but it actually is not the case because of the energy consumption of that product. So there was on a number of levels, we needed to first educate consumers about their various appliances and products, and then we needed to start to put that D, C, B, A, and rate these appliances. And in this process, an unexpected thing happened, which is the level of the products got so good, and the efficiently level, there's no more B appliances. It's just A and then A plus plus plus. So we've moved the standard level so high. And, you know, appliances were one of the very big challenges in domestic energy efficiency. And the efficiency of appliances are one of the key areas that we needed to make change. And we were able to very successfully, not only in the United Kingdom, but through a European-wide program. So I just wondered if you had something to reflect on as well. And when you're setting standards and you're working towards these kind of levels of certification, some of the surprises that came about, as well as some of the, as I asked before, some of the sort of specifics on things that you're working on that might be of interest.
Yeah, I mean, I realize we jumped right into the conversation, and some listeners may not, probably many listeners may not be familiar exactly what we do. And I do want to provide that context to, you know, as a membership organization, these sustainability standards that are members of ISEAL, they basically participate in our work because they are able to learn from each other. And these are global organizations. So if we think of ones that people are most likely to be familiar with, Fair Trade is a good one in the UK. That has a global coordinating body, and that global organization is the member of ISEAL. So the networks that go behind these labels that you see on products are extensive and global, and include themselves many other organizations. And each of those types of certification are really focused on a set of production practices in whatever commodities or sectors that they apply to. And we literally have members across not just agriculture and forestry and fisheries, but mining and water stewardship and electronics and building. So pretty much across every sector, you're going to find these sustainability standards. And these standards are really just organizations, they're networks of businesses and other stakeholders who have come together to define what good practice looks like for their sector, and then create tools to help support industry to move towards that good practice. And one of the things that I think, to your question, that we've seen that is quite intuitive, it's your example was really prescient in that, you know, it's quite I wouldn't say easy, but it's feasible to set expectations of what good practice looks like, to set that standard of responsible or potentially sustainable practice. But then it's another thing to move companies along a journey towards better practices, towards sustainability. You know, there's this idea that we just set a standard and then recognize everybody who meets the standard. Well, that's a great tool, and that's had a huge impact in many sectors where up to 20 or 30% of companies in a sector are able to meet that high performance standard. But we're talking about transforming whole industries, whole sectors, whole geographies. And that means providing tools and resources to everyone at all different levels of performance, and figuring out how can we incentivize them to improve. So a big transition or evolution over the last, I would say, probably 10 years is to recognize that this isn't just about rewarding the best practices or the best producers, but rather putting in place strategies or tools to support improvement, to say, okay, well, we know where you're at now, and sustainability is a journey, and we're going to help you to take those steps along that journey. whether that's capacity building or creating a structure like the ABCD improvement or stepwise levels with appliances, rewarding people for better practices at different levels of performance. All of these tools, I think, really recognize how challenging it is to move towards better practices, and also how the incentives or benefits that companies derive really are the things that are going to drive that improved practice.
A really fascinating shift has been that awareness that a company producing a product or a service, the supply chain is this enormous, almost like body that then has to move with whatever is at the end result of the production or the service, and that in order to be sustainable, in order to work going forward, in order to be thinking about a circular economy, we are all connected. And that is an important thing. And I think that is a very fascinating overlying message about what you're conveying today, is that connectivity between the business provider and the supply chain and the end user and even government policy. There is a massive connectedness that requires all players to engage in this process and to stay engaged. And this isn't just a sort of one-off. These relationships we're developing, and this need and desire to move the standards up and to get people trying to really work to a sort of global best practice, as it were, is a sort of a shift in the way we do business, which is with us now, hopefully, as we move forward into the new challenges. And as you were speaking about in terms of coronavirus, which the interesting lesson we have, as you said, is that we are able to make changes. We are able to motivate governments with this challenge of this pandemic to do something that they've never done before in terms of support for the workforce and support for businesses. And this is a very shifting paradigm. This is a big change from anything that's ever occurred before. And one of the things that the knock-on effect of all of us being in lockdown is the immediate impact it's having on emissions, and the immediate impact it's having on our use of fossil fuels. So we've been clamoring for, some of us climate change campaigners and sustainability campaigners have been clamoring for this for a long, long time, and upon deaf ears. And suddenly it is possible, it is achievable to do this. We just weren't able to motivate people sufficiently yet. But I think that all these little steps that are happening and all these changes of connecting people up, and it really is about, in some ways, it's about the global business, but it also comes back to the sort of the local community based experience. So a lot of us feel like being locked down, we don't want to live like this. This isn't what we're advocating, climate change advocates. We're not saying people need to hole up in their homes and lock down and not do anything. But there's certainly a lot of lessons and learnings that are coming on the back of this to say, actually, there's a lot more that's achievable. And joining up with your community is about healthy living. There's a positive out of being more connected to where we are as our base. And then, there's still, we need to engage the global movement. But I think that many things that are coming out of the situation we're in today, I'm reflecting on those as we're talking, how those changes and this whole shift, this global shift, is going to we'll either be able to take the learnings from this and grow and change, and this is a really ripe time for this, or we won't, and we'll fall back into our old patterns. But it feels like we're at a place where maybe, with all of the things that are influencing change right now, that this is a moment where we can say, actually, we're going to grow and learn. And I personally have been very inspired by the many responses, the organizations I work with, the businesses, the companies, the volunteer things I'm involved with. People are responding to this in very innovative ways. I think it just reflects on, who we are, human beings. We're, survival of the fittest, how we move and we evolve. And so maybe a lot of us thought, oh no, what are we going to do? Everything's going to grind to a halt. But in fact, people are coming up with incredibly creative and interesting ways to deal and to carry on and to keep doing business in the face of these changes. So I recognize I've covered a lot of themes in that last minute there, but it'd be interesting for you to just sort of tap in on some of those ideas and what you think, how that's shaping your work, and what this means for the sort of next step for what you're doing.
Yeah, and I so appreciate your comments. I mentioned at the outset, I think that crisis breeds creativity, and I'm optimistic. It is, you can get bogged down in the day-to-day heart-wrenching reality of this pandemic, and yet we have to balance that with not just the creativity, but the long-term opportunity coming out of something like this crisis, where even for our industry, let's just say very concretely, in these conversations we've been having with these global sustainability standards, just from an emissions perspective, you can imagine certification, the actual act of going out and assessing somebody's practices, is very travel and carbon intensive. It is about going to the field and looking at what farmers and what producing enterprises are doing. And already we're starting to see massive innovation in remote auditing, remote assessments. How can we use new technology to, simple stuff like, let's do video assessments where we just walk around the factory or the farm with the producers and see what they're doing. I mean, obviously there are technology limitations, but I think the potential for doing things in a fundamentally different way is something that not only are we getting creative now, but those will have lasting impacts on the efficiency and carbon intensity of how this work continues into the future. And I think the same can be said for consumer awareness, for both, recognizing, okay, well, this actually does show us how interconnected our supply chains are, how tenuous they are, and how we need to be more conscious about, very concretely, where our food comes from, and how we can do that in a way in the future that is more sustainable, whether that's more local or just more aware of the impacts that our choices are having. So I think there is a real opportunity for fundamental change. I mean, I think there's a huge risk, and if you look at this cynically, probability that we just come out of this with massive ramping up of trade and production as it was. And I think it's a very valid perspective that, first and foremost, we have to make sure that people are able to get back to work and to get an income coming in. And particularly, we're concerned about producers and those disadvantaged workers at the bottom of supply chains who are being affected more than others by crises like this. So that's a critical necessity. But within that, I think you will see that all of the interim solutions that we're putting in place are not so interim, that we are changing the nature of how we do business as a result of this crisis, and that will have long-lasting effects and hopefully really positive ones.
I'm hopeful as well, and I'm optimistic as well. And I do think maybe in some ways it's the sort of so-called perfect storm of circumstances that have come together and may lead to that change. So I think that's an interesting thought for us to be beginning to think about wrapping up our discussion today. I wondered whether or not, as we often do, sort of try at Idea Me to reflect on those people in our lives who've shaped things and who've influenced us. And I know that, we'll be influencing other people as we go through our journeys. Is there a person that you think about that you would like to meet, whether they're sort of living or not? Somebody who just has always inspired you and motivated you, and what would you say to that person?
So I'm going to go off script here because that's a I don't actually think that way. Generally, I like the people in my I think that coming back to my personal journey, the fact that I have now been working for an organization that is global in scope, and I'm still tucked away in my little village in the mountains of British Columbia, I think is really important in grounding me in the reality of place and the importance of place, and also to be surrounded by large, imposing homes. It kind of makes me recognize my own insignificance. And I mean this at a deeply personal level, that it's important for me to try to affect as much positive change as I can, and to know that I don't have to change the world. That if I do my part and everyone else does theirs, that we can make things a little bit better. And just being in this small community, the people I want to meet and hang out with are the ones that are closest to me, my good friends, my family. I want to be connected to place. And I think that grounding in nature and place is fundamental to being able to make effective change at any scale. And I hold that with me when I'm traveling internationally. Always look to coming back to this community and to my friends. And there isn't anyone out there I want to meet. I'm happy for people to be doing their work, and really what I'm most interested in is being able to share a common journey with people who are doing good work in many different fields, and know, as I said, that I'm really lucky to be working in a field where everyone is so kind and committed, and putting their energy into the little bit of change that they can affect. And hopefully all of us together can affect that change on a scale and at a pace that does get us to where we need to be in this relatively short time period. So yeah, I'm optimistic based on the energy of the people I work with and the friends and family in my life.
Wow, I really appreciate you sharing that sentiment today, because I think that is really a part of what the future is going to look like for us, for a healthier and happier future. It's about us connecting back to the places that we're at. We've spent a lot of decades now focusing on going out and sort of conquering the globe and being very, citizens of the world. And I am all for that. I'm an immigrant and I'm a citizen of the world myself. But I think that remembering where our roots are in the community and that local connection is really what it's about. And each of us making that small change, if we can convince everybody that they make a difference and they're important and what they do has a big impact on the bigger picture, I think that's an important message to remind everybody with. And I think it is one of optimism and one of looking forward, and one of, we know we have to change, but that change is not a bad thing. The fact that we need to be more sustainable, we need to be aware of the changing climate, that isn't a bad thing. I think that the idea that negative messaging and coming down on people for sort of abusing fossil fuels, as it were, a lot of people were very naive about it and didn't understand. And even us, those of us who've been championing change, also, there's a lot we have to go through on a personal level, and understanding that we all make a difference. And I think that's a great place to sort of say, end this interview with today, and some positive thinking for the future. And hopefully all of us can walk away from this COVID-19 experience and take something positive out of it and change the world as a result of it.
Well, great. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to finding out more about your work in the future.